In just a few months, U.S. President Barack Obama will leave office. His signature domestic accomplishment, his health care plan known as Obamacare, is collapsing. But what about his foreign policy legacy? As Gary Lane shows us in this in-depth report, many critics warn the president will leave the world in worse shape than when he found it.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
Moments after he was sworn in as the nation's 44th president, Barack Obama unveiled his foreign policy vision.
Our security emanates from the justness of our cause, the force of our example, the tempering qualities of humility and restraint. America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace.
9 months later, the Nobel Committee awarded him the Peace Prize, not for his accomplishments, but for what he intended to do on the world stage. And now, as Mr. Obama prepares to leave the White House, some security experts are questioning his foreign policy accomplishments and the consequences of his actions.
Supporters of the president's policies say he's leaving behind a more peaceful world, and eventually the Middle East will be a safer place. But as critics here on Capitol Hill say, nothing could be further from the truth. He's created a big mess for the next president.
Fred Fleitz is a former CIA analyst.
He received a prize for a naive worldview that we know in 2016 has been an utter failure.
During his first inaugural address, the president said he'd take steps to end America's wars.
We will begin to responsibly leave Iraq to its people and forge a hard-earned peace in Afghanistan.
But despite that promise, peace didn't come to Afghanistan. The president wanted to withdraw all U.S. forces by late 2014. But instead, a resurgent Taliban wreaked havoc on the country. So Obama had to reverse course. Today, more than 8,000 Americans still remain there. In Iraq, the president withdrew all American troops by the end of 2011, despite being warned repeatedly by top government officials and military advisors, including his own Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, about the potential consequences. But Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine says the president had no choice.
Iraq didn't want our troops to stay, and they wouldn't give us the protection for our troops.
But Panetta has written in his book that although an agreement was difficult, it could have been done. And critics, including GOP vice presidential candidate Mike Pence, say Obama's premature withdrawal from Iraq helped lead to the rise of the deadly Islamic terrorist group ISIS.
The sacrifices the American soldier made were squandered in Iraq because this administration created a vacuum in which ISIS was able to grow.
And once ISIS was on the scene after Obama's withdrawal from Iraq, it carried out a horrible genocide against Christians, Yazidis, and others in Iraq and Syria, causing a humanitarian crisis in the Middle East and Europe.
You don't walk away from a war when the other team is bringing it to you. That is, I've heard this president say he wants to get out of these wars, but when they bring it to you, you have no choice but to lead and to protect the American people.
Congressman Mike Pompeo is a member of the House Intelligence Committee.
He told us that al-Qaeda was on the run. He has since told us that the ISIS was the JV. This administration has consistently refused to take seriously the threat.
Not only abroad, but here at home, say Pompeo and others. When Omar Mateen murdered 49 Americans in Orlando earlier this year, President Obama refused to call it an act of Islamic terror.
There's no magic to the phrase radical Islam. It's a political talking point. It's not a strategy.
When we have a president who will not admit that we are at war with radical Islam, who won't even use the term, when we portray this threat as some threat from an isolated terrorist group and not a global ideology at war with modern society and Western civilization, we're never going to beat it.
In Syria, critics say feckless U.S. support of moderate rebel groups caused al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and the Islamic State to grow in power and influence. President Obama said he would draw a red line in the sand if Syrian President Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. Assad turned over 1,300 tons of the weapons, but later used a chemical weapon, chlorine gas, against the rebels. Obama took no military action. As a result, Russian President Vladimir Putin stepped up his country's involvement, sending aircraft and troops to help Assad. Republican vice presidential candidate Mike Pence says weak American leadership in the Middle East led to Russia's return to the region.
There's an old proverb that says the Russian bear never dies, it just hibernates.
That bear came out of hibernation 7 years after the Obama administration promised a reset of relations with Russia. And Putin moved not only in Syria, but also in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine.
We watched the Russians take 1/5 of a sovereign nation, and America's response was almost nothing. That tells Vladimir Putin he has a green light, and you've seen him use that power.
In Egypt, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood took office as president in the summer of 2012. But within months, he had issued a decree that basically gave him unlimited powers. His opponents called it an Islamic coup. Egyptians took to the streets in protest. President Obama demanded the Egyptian army restore Morsi and the Brotherhood to power. Some Egyptians claimed Brotherhood agents and sympathizers in the U.S. government influenced policy. Mohammed El Biari served on the president's Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council. El Biari had praised a Muslim Brotherhood leader and spoke at a 2004 event honoring Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. And the president of the Islamic Society of North America, a group with suspected ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, advised President Obama on immigration and counterterrorism policy.
It is a good deal.
Barack Obama would likely say his greatest foreign policy achievement was the nuclear deal with Iran. But many critics say the administration only accomplished the deal by keeping key parts of it secret.
In the fall of 2016, we have a nuclear deal that can only be described as an enormous fraud. The only way this deal got through is because the details of it were concealed from Congress.
Congressman Pompeo exposed several secret side deals in the agreement.
This president struck a secret deal with the Ayatollah that's really between him and the Ayatollah. It's not even signed by either party. And that will almost always end in a way that does not serve the American people's interests.
In the recent vice presidential debate, Tim Kaine said the Iran deal eliminated Iran's nuclear weapons program. President Bill Clinton's CIA director, James Woolsey, disagrees.
I think it's worse than worthless. I think it may well be the worst international agreement the United States has ever signed. I think it will enhance Iran's ability to move quickly to have a nuclear weapon and not slow it down.
The reason is Iran can continue to enrich uranium, develop advanced centrifuges, and will have a reactor that produces plutonium that is being redesigned by the Chinese and will not be monitored by a process set up by this treaty.
Woolsey is concerned about the cash payments the Obama administration delivered to Iran the same day American prisoners were released in Tehran, ultimately amounting to $150 billion.
We are turning over tens of billions of dollars to them, saying that we're getting away from sanctions. In part, it seems it's more likely that what that is a bribery, essentially, to the Iranians to release some of our people they have grabbed.
Pompeo and others believe the money provided by the U.S. may be used by Iran to spread terrorism and further develop its nuclear weapons program.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
So nearly 8 years after his swearing in, America's Nobel Peace Prize winning president has fallen short of his goal of ushering in a new era of peace, with many analysts warning that the world is now a more dangerous place than when he entered the White House.
The president thought when he came to office, his magnificence and his aura would solve all the world's problems. The fact is, these enemies of the United States hate us regardless of who's in the White House. They hate our way of life, they hate our country, and they didn't change the way they thought because Barack Obama became president.
And they're likely to pose greater danger for the world and the next American president. Gary Lane, CBN News, Washington.
Up next, hear what one Middle East expert warns could happen after the military campaign to liberate Mosul. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. The campaign to retake Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, has begun. It represents a milestone in the campaign to defeat ISIS in northern Iraq. But as Middle East expert Jonathan Spire warns, it also represents a new and perhaps more dangerous time in the Middle East, something he calls a war over the ruins. Jonathan, you just came back from Kurdistan. What are the dangers that you see when ISIS is defeated, perhaps in a few months or a few years?
Well, look, here's the thing. ISIS ultimately was a manifestation or a symptom of a much larger problem. And that problem is that Iraq is a divided country, divided along ethnic and sectarian lines. The fact of the matter is that the Sunni Arab people of Nineveh province as a whole, and of Mosul city in particular, were not particularly hostile to ISIS when it came in 2014. On the contrary, they're very, very hostile or upset with the government in Baghdad, controlled, of course, by the Dawa Party, a Shia Islamist party of which the current Prime Minister, Mr. Abadi, is a member. With the strong feeling the Sunnis had that was a government not committed to their welfare, not able to represent Sunnis. So from a certain point of view, they actually welcomed ISIS in. Of course, I assume they have now recovered from the sense that ISIS could represent anything positive for them. But the issue is that once ISIS is driven out, the underlying matter of Sunni-Shia division, very stark division in the country, will not go away. It will resurface. Will the Sunni Arabs of Mosul welcome the Shia-led Iraqi security forces into Mosul? Maybe they'll welcome on the day they come in. That sort of basic division in Iraq between Sunni and Shia Arabs, and then of course also with regard to the equally deep divisions between Arabs and Kurds, these are the things that are going to still be very much manifest once Mosul is taken, and it's going to manifest itself, I think, pretty soon. Who's going to control the city afterwards? What about the minority communities? What about the Shia militias? What about the Kurds? What about the areas of friction and conflict between them?
If there is a vacuum created, and you have the Kurds, the Shiite militias, the Iraqi government, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Turks, the Russians, do you see that as a potential explosive situation?
Well, yeah, I don't think the conflict is going to end in Iraq when ISIS is defeated. This is the point. ISIS is now, it's already lost around 50% of its holdings in Iraq. If and when Mosul does fall, any pretensions ISIS might have had to constituting an Islamic state in Iraq will effectively be gone. They'll be reduced to holding, some remote rural areas close to the Syrian border. But big question mark as to whether there's been sufficient reform and change in the Iraqi army since that terrible summer of 2014 when the army essentially fell apart. And my sense at least was a great deal still remains to be done, and I'm not yet convinced the Iraqi army is still a workable force. But secondly, the political side, the Kurds, of course, are surrounding the city to the east, north and west. And every Kurdish commander that I spoke to some of the most senior men on the lines there, want to talk about nothing other than Kurdish independence and the sense that they are no longer part of Iraq, and the way in which the fight for Mosul could be seen as a staging ground towards a Kurdish bid for independence. Of course, the Iraqi army absolutely opposed to that. Then put into the mix that the Turkish army is there close to Mosul in a place called Bashika, training a Sunni militia. Then put into the mix the fact that the Shia militias, supported by Iran, are also looking to play some kind of role in the Mosul area. So my sense is that when you look to the political level as well as the military, you discover, a very interesting and very confused and very divided reality.
And how about the Iraqi government? What's their agenda?
The Iraqi government is a Shia Islamist government, and I think that what's becoming increasingly clear is that this government is not really interested or able even to govern on behalf of all Iraqis, but rather is increasingly about building the power of the Iraqi Shia Arab majority, to a great extent at the expense of the Sunni Arab minority and indeed of the Kurds as well. So, I would say that the Iraqi government is more and more openly looking like a sectarian government.
Are they more and more allied with Iran, or is Iran influence on them dominating?
I think Iran's very much gaining an influence. ISIS and the rise of ISIS is largely a cause for that, because when ISIS came in and Baghdad was under real threat, Ayatollah Sistani, the venerated Shia cleric in Iraq, ordered a mobilization of Shia militias to defend Baghdad. And the fact of the matter is that mobilization is now 100,000 men strong, and many different militias, but the 5 or 6 central militias in that mobilization are all linked to Iran. The sense is that the Iranians are very good at taking advantage of countries that are falling apart. They work very well in those environments, and Syria is an example of that, and Iraq also is increasingly an example of that.
Could it get even larger, this conflict?
Well, here's the thing. What you effectively have, in my view at least, is you have one conflict today which encompasses both Iraq and Syria. Effectively, those countries have collapsed and fragmented. And what you have is a kind of war over the ruins being fought out between a whole variety of different political, military forces over the ruins of those countries. So between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea today, there is not any single properly functioning state, and I'd include Lebanon in that mix too. And what there is instead of that is a kind of ongoing, roiling, very difficult to resolve conflict or series of conflicts between different interests, each trying to advance their own interests over the ruins of what those countries once were.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline. Appreciate your insight and expertise.
Most welcome.
In October, a series of reports appeared in the Washington Post and other US media about expected supplies of various modern weapon systems to the so-called moderate opposition in Syria. The reports argued that Washington was considering a new plan for Syria that included massive supplies of weapons that had to allow the oppositioneers to defend themselves from the Russian and Syrian air power and artillery. This fact was described as an indication of Washington's skepticism about the prospects of a so-called peaceful solution in the country. Nonetheless, it was neither approved nor denied, according to the media. The secret CIA program of training and arming moderate terrorists has been at the core of American strategy since the start of the war, aiming to overthrow Assad and set up a puppet government in Syria. Nonetheless, the Obama administration is likely set to postpone the resumption and expansion of this program and to pass the need to make a decision on to the next president. The US leadership is not ready to make the decision now because the recent military developments have shown that despite all money spending, supplies and CIA efforts, Washington can still not rely on the moderate terrorists as a clearly pro-US force on the ground. Every US attempt to separate secular militant groups from jihadi factions, at least for PR purposes, have failed, and the recently created new Syrian army, NSYA, has shown impotence in clashes with ISIS. The US propaganda campaign to discredit the Russian, Syrian, Iranian operations to liberate Aleppo faced a significant problem: the massive civilian casualties occurring during the Mosul offensive, supported by the US-led coalition. In this case, open and massive supplies of arms and munitions to the terrorist groups in Syria could lead to significant losses for Washington in political and PR terms, and will hardly lead to the strengthening of US influence in the Syrian conflict. If the US administration avoids doing this, Moscow, Damascus and Tehran will fully take over the initiative in the war, which would also lead to negative effects on US influence in the Middle East. So, most likely is that Washington will make a compromise decision to allow its regional allies, Saudi Arabia or Qatar, to supply limited numbers of man-portable air defense systems to the so-called opposition, even if this opposition is al-Nusra Front. At the same time, the US-controlled media and diplomats will continue to put pressure on Syria, Russia and Iran over the alleged civilian casualties in Aleppo City, and will ignore the humanitarian situation in Iraq. It will not allow the terrorists to retake the initiative in the war, but will buy time until the new US president comes into office and starts to implement his or her own strategy in the region.
This is AP News Minute. The FBI informed Congress Friday it is investigating whether there is classified information in new emails that have emerged in its probe of Hillary Clinton's private server. At a rally in New Hampshire, GOP nominee Donald Trump praised the FBI's decision, saying, quote, "Perhaps finally justice will be done." 2 explosions said to be caused by explosive-laden vehicles were seen in the Syrian city of Aleppo in footage released by a pro-opposition news agency. The explosions came on the day rebels launched a large-scale offensive to break the government siege of Aleppo's opposition-held eastern districts. 2 freight trains crashed head-on in Pennsylvania, injuring 2 crew members. Neither train was carrying hazardous materials. Officials are trying to determine how fast each train was traveling at the time and what caused the crash. As part of the public tours, as well as in recognition of Halloween, several impersonators were on hand at the White House portraying past presidents and first ladies. In the Red Room, former First Lady Dolly Madison discussed the various ice creams she served while at the White House, while Abraham Lincoln posed for pictures under his actual portrait.
Coalition faction heads are set to meet on Sunday to discuss the bill to shut down the controversial new public broadcasting body, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seeking its closure. Coalition Chairman MK David Bitan, who is promoting the bill, says that it is completely clear that this broadcasting authority will be of the staunch left. Finance Minister Moshe Kachlon is likely to be the one to tip the scales. He opposes the bill, but is under pressure from Netanyahu to support it. A vote is not expected to be taken at the meeting. The late former President Shimon Peres is starring in a campaign supporting the settlement block of Ma'ale Adumim between Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. The aim of the campaign is to convince the Prime Minister that Ma'ale Adumim would remain in Israel within the framework of a future Palestinian state. Government Minister Tzachi Hanegbi is pushing the Prime Minister to open all the sealed documents pertaining to the missing Yemenite babies affair. He says there is no logical reason or protocol why the materials should remain sealed after 70 years. The materials in question include statements made by caregivers of babies who claim to have seen Western-looking individuals coming to adopt the babies. Hanegbi also says there is no reason to believe that otherwise healthy babies would suddenly die under mysterious circumstances. Jewish-American reporter Danielle Barron rebuffed the apology of prominent Israeli journalist Ari Shavit, who Barron claims touched her in ways she did not want to be touched and made her feel unsafe.
Ari Shavit has reached out to me, and I am hopeful that at some point, when we are both ready, we will be able to have a meaningful conversation about what has transpired.
When I got in my car at the end of the night, I felt relief. I felt safe again, and I felt better just not being in an environment that was compromising.
It's incredibly important to be vigilant, especially in the work environment. So I applaud Haaretz for making such a statement, and I hope that they will enact it.
In a statement issued by Shavit, he said he thought the encounter constituted flirting and courtship, but that he apologizes from the depths of his heart if it was misconstrued as otherwise. Although Barron says she's glad that Shavit acknowledged that the encounter took place, she doesn't accept his apology because he doesn't admit to sexual assault. The Haaretz newspaper, for which Shavit works, issued a statement condemning all forms of sexual harassment, and Barron lauded the paper for its condemnation while maintaining that she was a victim. And finally, Education Minister Naftali Bennett's education reform to get more high school students to take higher-level exams in math is in danger. Israeli teachers are threatening to strike if they aren't paid for extra classroom hours, and the Education Ministry has not responded to those demands. Meanwhile, the ministry says the students will get what they have been promised.
This is AP News Minute. Iraqi forces pushed Islamic State group fighters out of a town south of Mosul Saturday as state-sanctioned Shiite militias joined the offensive by opening up a new front to the west. Iraqi troops advanced into the town after a wave of U.S.-led airstrikes and artillery shelling against militant positions inside the town. Thousands of people gathered in central Seoul calling for South Korea's president to step down over allegations that she let an old friend, the daughter of a religious cult leader, interfere in important state affairs. The protesters began marching after a peaceful candlelight vigil, and the police responded by creating a cordon to stop the protesters. More than 100 shops and dozens of vehicles were destroyed after a fire broke out in a temporary fireworks market in India. There were no casualties, and the cause of the fire was not immediately known, according to local media. Huge crowds in costumes took to the streets in Tokyo ahead of Halloween. The costumed ghouls, goblins, and witches mingled with comic book characters and manga heroes.
A hypersonic aircraft known as Article 4202 or 15U-71 was successfully tested for the first time on the 25th of October during gunnery drill from the Dombarovsky launcher deployment area in the Orenburg region at the Kuram missile test range in Kamchatka. All the onboard equipment, avionics as well as garden systems are made of the Russian components. The weapon is capable of moving at a speed of around 7 km per second at the maximum height. The device is designed to be installed in advanced intercontinental ballistic missiles instead of traditional warheads. 4202 starts operating at a height of about 100 kilometers and flies to the target at a speed of 5 to 7 kilometers per second. While before entering thick layers of atmosphere above the target, the hypersonic aircraft conducts a difficult maneuver which hampers its being intercepted by means of missile defense. It should be noted that the project of combat blocks named Albatross occurred in the USSR in the mid-1980s as a response to the US attempt to create missile defense in the framework of the Star Wars conception.
An Iranian parliamentary report says the nuclear agreement between Tehran and the P5+1 group has led to the removal of all nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. The report, however, is critical of U.S. restrictions, which it blames for existing problems in Iran's access to the global financial system. Iraq's prime minister has dismissed reports that the operation to liberate the Daesh-held city of Mosul has been halted. Haydar al-Abadi says the operation is going on all fronts and will continue until the terrorists are driven out. The offensive to retake Mosul began 2 weeks ago. Georgians are going to polling stations in runoff elections for a new parliament. The voting is taking place in 50 of the 73 election districts where no candidates won an outright victory on October the 8th. The ruling Georgian Dream is poised for a landslide victory. A magnitude 6.6 earthquake has struck central Italy, bringing down numerous buildings, including historic churches. The Civil Protection Department has reported no deaths, but says a number of people have been injured. Central Italy was also struck by powerful earthquakes on Wednesday, which left thousands homeless. Venezuela's government and opposition are to meet on Sunday to find a solution to the ongoing political crisis. The government says discussions aim to end the opponents' anti-constitutional actions. The opposition says it's attending the talks with skepticism. Negotiations follow the opposition's attempts to oust President Nicolas Maduro. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos promises to restore lasting peace in his country. This comes amid fears that the government's peace deal with FARC rebels could end in failure. The two sides reached the deal following lengthy discussions, but it was nearly rejected in a referendum earlier this month.
Special Committee of the U.S. Congress reported that the Chinese agents had stolen the Pentagon plans on how to carry out the future war. According to Free Beacon, which referred to the report, the United States faces a large and growing threat to its national security from Chinese intelligence collection operations. The experts highlighted that China's efforts to penetrate closed cyberspace and the U.S. national security agencies is the most serious threat. It is forecasted that the Chinese special services could get access to 5.6 million fingerprints, some of which could be used to identify undercover U.S. government agents or to create duplicates of biometric data to obtain access to classified areas. According to estimations of the authors of this report, activity of the Chinese intelligence has increased significantly for the last 15 years and is conducted through various services, including the Ministry of State Security, the People's Liberation Army, and other military organizations.
Mr. President, honored delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we shall propose further cooperative efforts between all the nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. We shall propose, finally, a global systems of communication satellites linking the whole world in telegraph and telephone and radio and television. The day need not be far away when such a system will televise the proceedings of this body to every corner of the world for the benefit of peace.
Kennedy was talking about weather control with confidence. In April of the previous year, the Tyros satellite had been launched from Cape Canaveral and equipped with solar power to send back images of cloud formations. The national press announced that Tyros, quote, opens up new vistas for weather forecasting and control, unquote. But developments in weather control had already been underway. In 1958, the military announced success with weather modification, by sending powerful electromagnetic beams into the upper atmosphere using ionospheric heaters like the one at HAARP today. There's a longer article on the history of weather modification in the link below. I advise you to read it, look through it, see the people involved to get a better sense of where we stand on weather modification and even global warming. 1964 cartoon of the Tyro satellite. Little humor. When we predict snow, it snows.